And now we bring you the muscular system. Main functions of the muscular system are as follows. They make movement possible, including the movement of blood. It generates heat, which is especially important for those of us that are warm-blooded, also known as endotherms. That heat is used to maintain a stable internal body temperature. It provides support for our joints, keep them healthy, and it helps us to maintain posture. Muscles are connected to each other by tendons, and they are also connected not only muscle to muscle, but muscle to bone, which is, of course, what makes it possible for you to move your arms and legs, is because your muscles are connected to bone. So tendons are tough connective tissues that connect muscle to muscle and muscle to bone. Check out his six-pack. That's crazy. All right. The human body contains more than 650 individual muscles, most of which, just like with your bones, are in your hands and your feet because there's so many tiny little muscles there and so many fine movements that you need to do. These are almost all attached to skeleton. There are two categories of muscles, voluntary muscles and involuntary muscles. Voluntary muscles are the ones that you basically think about to make happen. You know, I want to walk over there. I want to dance in the rain. And you do it, and that's voluntary. Involuntary muscles are the ones that you don't have to think about to get them to move, and these include things like breathing. So your diaphragm is an involuntary muscle. Your heartbeat. So, you know, if you had to think about your heart beating, you would have to sit here all day long and go heartbeat, 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 heartbeat. I got to move faster. Heartbeat, 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 heartbeat. Okay, anyway, it would be a pain. And then also moving food through your gut is an involuntary process, because you really don't want to have to think about that either. Muscles are further subdivided into three different types that are characterized by the type of movement they are responsible for. So first off are the skeletal muscles, also known as striated muscle. These are attached to the skeleton for voluntary motion, so they're the ones that help us to, you know, pump iron, tackle people, run really fast, do handstands, do splits, whatever, you know, those are all skeletal muscle. If they're attached to your limbs and you have control over them, then usually they're skeletal. They have an alternate name, which is called striated muscle, and this is mainly due to the fact that they have a certain banding pattern called striations that are seen really readily under the microscope. And I'll show you a picture of that here shortly, right here. So that's a microscope image of striated muscle or skeletal muscle. And you can see that it's very parallel in their organization, very uniform. Okay. The other thing about striated muscle is it makes up about 40% of an adult's body weight. All right. The next type of muscle is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle controls involuntary movement and, you know, all the things that you need to stay alive, like breathing, like the flow of blood through different arteries. It's not your heart, because your heart is something separate, but there's other muscles associated with your blood vessels. Also your intestines, the movement of food. It is not striated, it is smooth in appearance when you look at it under the microscope. It looks more like this, so that banding pattern that we saw in the previous slide you don't see in smooth muscle. Instead you just see all the little nuclei, which are all of these little guys. These are the nucleus. These are all nuclei. But no banding. Cardiac muscle is your last muscle group, and as the name would suggest, this is responsible solely for your heart pumping. It is also an involuntary action. Your heart can just beat, 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 beat without you thinking about it, which is a good thing. They are striated, sort of like the skeletal muscle was, but instead of them being really parallel and uniform in their organization, they are woven together, sort of braided almost, and that's mainly because of their purpose, is that they're designed to pump. And to pump, you need to have a weave so that you can create that pumping action. When you look at them under the microscope, they don't look regularly spaced or parallel. You can see that there's some weave and braidiness to them. So if we were going to look at some different types of muscle, here's one here, and we can see the nuclei, we can see kind of long, smooth, no striation, so that would mean that this is smooth. This muscle over here, we can see some striations, right? But they're not parallel, they're woven, so that would be cardiac. And then that leaves us the last one, which is much more uniform in their organization, much more uniform, and banding. So this is skeletal. Good. All right, as far as muscle structure goes, muscles are made up of muscle fibers, and a muscle fiber is a single multinucleated muscle cell. So that means they have more than one nucleus. Basically, a whole bunch of, when they're forming, it's a whole bunch of cells line up all along a line, and they fuse together. So that means that all of those single cells that each have their own nucleus, it becomes one long cell with a whole bunch of nuclei. Muscles may be made up of hundreds or even thousands of muscle fibers depending on the needs of that particular muscle. And although muscle fiber makes up most of muscle tissue, a large amount of connective tissue, blood vessels, nerves are also present within a muscle fiber. So muscle fibers consist, or muscles in general consist of muscle tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, all of that is involved in creating a muscle, which some of you hopefully will recognize, a bunch of tissues working together for a purpose. It means that muscles are all, yeah, I heard somebody say it, organs. All right, they're all organs. So the connective tissue covers and supports the muscle fiber, reinforcing it, and then, the health of the muscle fiber is dependent upon the blood supply and the nerves that innervate it. Okay. Continuing on about exactly what's inside of a muscle fiber. Muscle fibers consist of bundles of thread-like structures called myofibrils. These myofibrils are made up of two types of protein filaments, a thick sort of group of filaments and a thin group of filaments. The thick filaments are made up of a protein called myosin, and the thin filaments are made up of a protein called actin. If you want to think actin for thin and my fat, I don't know. Anyway, whatever works for you. The myosin and actin filaments are arranged to form overlapping patterns, which are responsible for the light and dark bands that you see on skeletal muscle. If they're really regularly spaced, that you'll see the banding really strongly. But if they're not as regularly spaced, like in the case of smooth muscle, then you won't see that banding as heavily. The thin actin filaments are anchored at their midpoint to a structure called the Z-line. And basically, the region from one Z-line to another, and I'm going to show you a picture so it should make more sense, but the region from one Z-line to another is known as a sarcomere, and it is this sarcomere that is the functional unit of muscular contraction. So we're going to make this your functional and structural unit for the muscle system, okay? So anyway, you've got, a muscle here. This is, your big muscle group. And if you were able to break out a little fiber, you'd see that you could break that into even smaller fibers and into even smaller fibers until you get down to a single myofibril. All right. And then if you look along this myofibril, it consists of just stacks of these structures right here called a sarcomere. Okay. And the sarcomere exists from, this is one Z-line, from one Z-line to another, okay? So from one Z-line to another is one sarcomere. In the middle of the sarcomere, on the midline, you'll see the myosin, which are the thicker, these are the thicker fibers. And then you'll see the actin on the edges connected to that Z-line. Those are the thinner fibers, all right? And when a contraction happens, basically I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, so I'm going to leave that there for now. All right, this video I'm going to show in class. I don't want to play it right here because it'll take up too much space. All right, so muscles can only move in one direction. They actually shorten. Okay, so how this happens. Basically, a motor neuron signal is sent. Myosin attaches to the actin in multiple places using all those little Ohr heads, and I'll show you another picture here in a second. And at each active site, the myosin pulls on the actin, and that power stroke, it's just like rowing almost. That power stroke shortens the sarcomere. And then once the neuron stops signaling, the myosin will release the actin and it allows the sarcomere to stretch back out and relax. Okay, so let's see if we can identify the actin and the myosin in this next image from what I've already told you. Okay, so what you are looking at right now is one sarcomere. All right, this is a Z line and this is a Z line. So in between is one sarcomere. Okay, again, the thin lines, these are the actin, all right? And then these guys, the big thick green ones, are your myosin, all right? And here's a little animation showing the little Ohr head of the myosin grabbing a hold of the actin and pulling on it. And all this other stuff that's flying around is basically ATP and other enzymes that are making this possible, okay? All right, so if we're going to look at this structure, I'm hoping by now you're getting points of reference and you can identify that the sarcomere in this diagram is that, okay? And again, you see that there's so many of these little myosin heads so that when they're engaged by that neuron telling it to, contract, they all reach up, grab a hold of the actin, and pull on it. And so in essence, the Z lines all get pulled towards the center because the myosin is all pulling from both sides from that midline. And that's what causes your muscles to shorten and contract. Well, okay, if muscles can only move in one direction, if they only shorten, how do we get movement in so many different directions? How does that happen? It has a lot to do with the fact that muscles work in pairs, all right? We use more than one muscle to do this, okay? We use one muscle to move in one direction and one muscle to move in the other direction, okay? So an example of this would be flexors and extensors, which are two, this is a kind of muscle pair group. If a muscle bends a part of your body, it is called a flexor. So your biceps that bend your forearm up towards your body, that's a flexor. If the muscle straightens part of your body, it is called an extensor. So it extend out the arm. That would be an extensor, and that would be, in the case of this example, bicep tricep. So your triceps would be the extensor. Flexor and extensor pairs provide almost all the movement of your skeleton. I mean, all your various skeletal movements are usually related to some sort of flexor and extensor pair. So you can see it here again as an example. Okay, you've got your bicep here. When it shortens, it causes your arm to bend and flex up. Okay, and then when you shorten your tricep on the back side of your arm, it pulls this back this way, which extends your arm back out again. That's all it is. It's a whole bunch of levers. All right, so how do we control the strength of our movement? That takes us to this point, okay? Basically, when you are told to contract, when your muscle fiber is told to contract, it contracts 100%. Like there's no like partial contraction. You basically just contract full on. So the way that we get any control in the strength of our movement is by controlling how many muscle fibers contract at the same time, okay? Because one muscle fiber will always go 100% or nothing. So to get control, we control how many muscle fibers will contract at any given time. One nerve is connected to a certain number of fibers, of those muscle fibers, okay? So when that nerve fires, all of those muscle fibers will go boom, okay? So basically, if we have a lot of nerves sending signals. That means a lot of muscle fibers are contracting at the same time, and that means a bigger and stronger muscular contraction. Whereas if we only had a few nerves firing, that would mean much fewer muscle fibers shortening, and it would be a much finer, smaller response. I hope you understand that. That's how it works. All right, a motor unit. A motor unit is defined as a motor neuron, which is basically a nerve that controls muscle, and all of the muscle fibers that it is connected to. Innervates just means it's connected to them, okay? So a motor neuron, that nerve, plus the muscle fibers it's connected to is known as a motor unit, okay? By using more motor units, the muscle contracts with more force. By using smaller numbers of motor units, then we have a much weaker force, much finer control, okay? So large numbers, crude control, like picking up your backpack or a couch or something, or your, big brother, whatever. But a smaller number would be like picking your pencil up off the floor or a toothpick or something, okay? All right, exercise. There are two different kinds of exercise that muscles require to stay strong. And most of you should already know what these are. The first one is resistance exercise, which requires that muscles overcome some sort of resistance, some sort of weight counteracting motion. And then the other type of exercise is aerobic exercise, like running or swimming laps or something that strengthens your heart along with increasing the endurance of your muscle itself, your skeletal muscle. So those are the two main types of muscle exercises that we do, either resistance exercise or aerobic exercise, more endurance related. And that, I believe, takes us to the end of the muscular system. Well done.